The candles in the ballroom burned too bright that night, and every eye in the room was fixed on the same man. Duke Edmund Ashcombe stood near the tall windows with his hands behind his back, and the crowd around him had already pulled away, the way people step back from a fire they do not trust. Nobody spoke to him directly. Nobody dared. Alina Hale noticed this the moment she walked in. She had heard the whispers before she ever saw his face. They said he had not danced in 3 years. They said his wife had died in his arms during a waltz, right there on a ballroom floor much like this one, and that he had never stepped onto polished wood again. They said his silence was not sadness anymore. They said it was something colder. Alina did not believe half of what she heard in ballrooms. She had learned long ago that gossip grew teeth the longer it sat unchecked, and that most of what people feared about a person was really just fear of the unknown wrapped in a prettier story. Still, she watched him from across the room, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, curiosity. The orchestra began a new song, and the dance floor filled quickly, couples slipping into position with practiced ease. Ashcombe did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing, watching the dancers the way a man watches rain fall against a window, present but somehow far away. A woman near Alina leaned toward her friend and whispered that the Duke's stare could stop a heart. Alina almost laughed out loud. She excused herself from the small circle of acquaintances she had been standing with and began walking. She did not plan the walk carefully. If she had stopped to plan it, she would have talked herself out of it, and she had already spent too many evenings in ballrooms doing exactly what was expected of her. Tonight, she wanted to do something else. The room noticed her before she reached him. She felt the shift, the way conversations paused mid-sentence, the way fans stopped moving in front of powdered faces. She kept walking anyway. Her steps were even. Her chin was level. She had worn a plain green dress that night, simpler than most of the gowns around her, and she was suddenly glad of it because it meant she had nothing extra to hide behind. When she reached him, he turned his head slightly, as if he had felt her approach before he saw her. Up close, he did not look like the frightening figure the whispers had built. He looked tired. There was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of long nights and longer thoughts, and his jaw was set in the careful way of someone bracing for an insult he expected to come from any direction. Alina did not give him the chance to brace for long. She asked him to dance. The words left her mouth simply, without dramatic flourish, the same way she might have asked a shopkeeper for the time. For a moment, the Duke said nothing at all. Behind her, she heard a sharp intake of breath from someone close enough to overhear, and she resisted the urge to turn and see who it was. Ashcombe studied her face as though searching for the trick in her words. She let him look. She had nothing to hide, and she had asked what she meant to ask. "You are aware," he said finally, his voice low and even, "that I do not dance." "I have heard that," Alina said. "I have also heard that ghosts wander the east wing of Marbury House, and that the miller's daughter turned into a swan. I do not put much stock in things I have only heard." Something flickered across his face. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough to one that Alina felt a small victory settle in her chest. "You are very bold," he said. "I am very bored," she corrected. "There is a difference, though I admit the two often travel together." He looked past her toward the dance floor where the current song was drawing toward its end. The candlelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, and Alina saw, for just a moment, something underneath the tiredness. Not anger. Grief, worn smooth by time, the way a stone in a river gets worn smooth by water it can no longer fight. "One dance," he said, "and you should know I will step on your feet. It has been a long while." "I will forgive you," Alina said, "provided you do not step on them twice." He offered his arm, and the room seemed to hold its breath as one. Alina placed her hand on his sleeve and let him lead her onto the floor, and she was aware, with every step, of the eyes following them, of the fans that had gone still, of the whispers that would multiply by morning into something far larger than the truth. The music began again, A simple waltz, gentle and unhurried. Ashcombe's hand found her waist with a stiffness that told her he had rehearsed this in his mind 1,000 times over 3 long years, and never once let his body follow through. For the first few bars, they moved carefully, like two people testing ice they were not certain would hold their weight. He did not step on her feet. His movements, though rusty, were precise, the product of years of training that had not left him even in absence. Alina found herself matching his pace easily, and something in her chest loosened, the tension of the watching room fading into the background as the music took over. "You dance very well for a man who claims to have forgotten how," she said. "I did not say I forgot," he answered. "I said I do not. And yet here you are." "Here I am," he agreed, and there was something almost rueful in the way he said it, as though he, too, was surprised to find himself on the floor. They turned slowly, and Alina caught glimpses of the room spinning past them, the candlelight blurring into gold streaks, the faces of the crowd frozen in various shades of disbelief. She kept her attention on him instead, on the careful control in his shoulders, on the way his eyes did not quite meet hers but did not look away either, settling somewhere near her collarbone as though that were a safer place to rest. "They will talk about this for weeks," she said. "They already talk about everything," he replied. "One more subject will hardly overwhelm them." "Does it bother you, the talking?" He was quiet for a moment, and Alina thought perhaps she had pressed too far too fast, the way she often did when curiosity got ahead of her manners. But then he answered, and his voice had dropped lower, meant only for her. "It used to. Now it simply exists like weather. One learns to dress for it and carry on." Alina considered this. She thought of all the nights she had spent watching him from across rooms just like this one, always alone, always separate, as though an invisible wall stood between him and everyone else in attendance. She wondered how long a man could stand behind a wall before he began to believe it was load-bearing, before he began to think the wall was the only thing holding him upright. "I asked you to dance because I was curious," she admitted. "I will tell you that honestly, since you have been honest with me." "Curious about what?" "Whether the wall was really as thick as everyone said." He looked at her then, truly looked, for the first time since she had approached him. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, and for one unguarded second, Alina saw something raw pass through them, something that looked very much like relief. "And what is your conclusion?" he asked. "I have not finished gathering evidence," she said. "One dance is hardly enough data for a proper conclusion." That earned her the smile she had been chasing since she crossed the floor, small and reluctant, but real. It changed his whole face, softened the sharp lines that gossip had turned into something fearsome, and Alina understood in that moment exactly why every mother in the room steered her daughters away from him. It was not because he was cold. It was because he was not, and pretending otherwise was safer for everyone involved. The song ended too soon. The final note hung in the air, and the dancers around them began to break apart, bowing and curtsying in practiced pairs. Ashcombe released her hand slowly, as though unwilling to be the one to end the contact first, and bowed with the same precision he had shown in every step of the dance. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the data." Alina curtsied, fighting back a laugh that threatened to spill out at the worst possible moment. "I shall need further study, Your Grace, before I can say anything definitive." "Then I hope you will not keep me waiting long for the next round of research." He said it lightly, almost as a joke, but Alina caught the flicker of something underneath the words, something hopeful and a little frightened at once, like a man testing a door he was not certain was safe to open. She smiled at him and stepped back into the crowd, aware immediately of the sea of faces turning toward her. Aware of the whispers already climbing louder behind cupped hands and painted fans. She did not look back to see if he was watching her go. She already knew he was. She could feel it, the way one feels warmth from a fire without needing to turn and look at the flames. Across the room, An older woman in deep blue silk leaned toward her companion, eyes wide with scandal already forming on her tongue. "Did you see?" the woman whispered. "The Duke danced." With her companion answered, voice equally hushed. "The hale girl, no fortune to speak of, no connections worth mentioning." "Then what," the first woman asked, "does she want with him?" Elinor, walking past them without appearing to listen, allowed herself a small, private smile. She did not know yet exactly what she wanted, only that curiosity had led her across a ballroom floor toward a man everyone else had decided to fear, and that whatever came next, it would not be boring. Behind her, the music started again, and this time when she glanced back, the Duke of Ashcombe had not returned to his post by the window. He was watching her still, his hands no longer clasped behind his back but loose at his sides, as though something in him, some old and rusted mechanism, had just begun to move again after years of standing still. Elinor did not know it then, but the whole house would be talking about that single dance before the sun rose the next morning. Servants would carry the story to kitchens, and kitchens would carry it to markets, and markets would carry it far beyond the city until it reached ears that had never once set foot inside that ballroom. She would learn soon enough that a single dance, when danced with the right person, could travel faster than any carriage, and that some doors, once opened even a crack, could not easily be closed again. For now, though, she simply walked back toward her small circle of friends, feeling the warmth of the candlelight on her shoulders and the weight of 100 curious stares on her back, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind either one at all. By the time the sun rose over the city, Elinor's name was already moving from house to house faster than any letter could travel. Her aunt, with whom she lodged during the season, burst into her room before breakfast with a look on her face that was somewhere between horror and delight. "You danced with the Duke of Ashcombe," her aunt said, as though repeating the sentence might make it more believable. "I did," Elinor said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It was one dance, Aunt Margaret, not a wedding." "One dance with that man is worth 10 weddings to anyone else," her aunt replied, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Elinor did have some idea, though she suspected the truth had already been stretched well past recognition. By midday, she had heard 3 separate versions of the previous night's events, each one more dramatic than the last. In one telling, she had fainted in his arms. In another, he had wept openly on the dance floor. In the third and most absurd, she had apparently declared her intention to marry him before the entire assembled company. None of it was true, but Elinor had learned that truth rarely mattered once a story caught fire. What mattered now was what came next, and she found herself both wary and strangely eager to find out. The invitation arrived 2 days later, delivered by a footman in dark green livery, who bowed so low that Elinor half expected him to topple over. It was an invitation to a garden party at Ashcombe Hall, addressed specifically to Miss Elinor Hale, and it caused another wave of gossip to ripple through the household before Elinor had even finished reading it. "You must go," her aunt said immediately. "You simply must." "I intend to," Elinor answered, "though I would go regardless of what anyone thought I should do." The garden at Ashcombe Hall was nothing like the crowded ballrooms Elinor had grown used to that season. It stretched wide and green behind the great stone house, dotted with rose bushes just beginning to bloom and paths lined with clipped hedges that led toward a small ornamental lake at the far end of the property. Guests moved in loose clusters across the lawn, teacups in hand, voices low and pleasant in the warm afternoon air. Elinor found the Duke standing near the orangery, half hidden by the shade of a large oak tree, watching the gathering with the same distant expression she had noticed the night they danced. He seemed more at ease here, though, in his own grounds, away from the crush of a ballroom, and when he saw her approaching, something shifted in his posture, an easing of the shoulders that she found herself cataloging without quite meaning to. "Miss Hale," he said, inclining his head, I confess I did not expect you to accept the invitation. Why would I not? Elinor asked. I told you I required further data. That earned her the same small, reluctant smile from before, and she felt a small thrill of satisfaction at having produced it twice now. I had wondered if that was simply a clever way of ending an awkward conversation. It was not clever, Elinor said. It was entirely honest. I rarely bother with cleverness when honesty will do the same work. They walked together along the edge of the garden, keeping a respectable distance that nonetheless felt closer than the space between them at the ball. He pointed out the roses his mother had planted decades before, explaining with surprising patience which varieties bloomed earliest and which required the most careful tending. Elinor listened, genuinely interested, and found herself asking questions that pulled longer answers from him than she suspected he usually gave. You know a great deal about flowers for a duke, she observed. My mother believed every gentleman should know how to grow something, he said. She thought it kept a man honest. Flowers do not respond to titles or fortune. They respond only to care or the lack of it. A wise woman. She was, he agreed, and something in his voice tightened slightly, a door closing gently before it could open too far. Elinor noticed but did not push. She had learned, even in this short acquaintance, that Ashcombe offered pieces of himself in careful measures, and that pressing too hard only made him retreat further behind the wall she was still determined to understand. They reached the small lake at the far end of the garden, its surface calm and mirror still beneath the afternoon sun. A pair of swans drifted near the far bank, indifferent to the guests scattered across the lawn behind them. I used to come here often, Ashcombe said, his eyes fixed on the water, before. He did not finish the sentence, and Elinor did not ask him to. She understood, without needing the words spelled out, exactly what before referred to, and she let the silence sit between them instead of filling it with questions she suspected he was not ready to answer. It is a beautiful spot, she said instead. I can see why you would want to keep it. I have not been back here in 3 years, he admitted, and the words seemed to surprise even him as he said them. Until today. Elinor turned to look at him properly then, and she saw, for the first time, real uncertainty in his expression, a rawness that the polished manners of the ballroom had kept hidden 2 nights before. He looked younger somehow, standing there beside the water, as though the years of careful distance had temporarily fallen away. I did not mean to intrude on something private, she said quietly. You are not intruding, he said. I invited you here. I am not entirely certain why, but I did. Perhaps, Elinor offered, some part of you wanted company by the water again. He glanced at her sharply, and for a moment she wondered if she had overstepped, if her directness had finally pushed too far past the careful boundaries he kept around himself. But then his expression softened, and he nodded slowly, as though admitting something to himself as much as to her. Perhaps, he said, you are remarkably observant, Miss Hale. I have been told it is one of my few useful qualities, she said lightly, hopping to ease the sudden weight that had settled over the conversation, along with an unfortunate habit of speaking my mind before considering whether I should. I find I do not mind it, he said. Most people around me choose their words as though each one might explode if handled wrong. It is exhausting, being treated like something fragile that might shatter at the slightest disturbance. I promise not to treat you as fragile, Elinor said, though I make no promises about my patience for people who whisper about you behind fans. That drew a genuine laugh from him, short and surprised, as though the sound itself had caught him off guard. It transformed his face entirely, chasing away the last of the shadows that had gathered there moments before, and Elinor found herself smiling in response before she could stop herself. They continued walking, the conversation turning lighter, touching on books they had both read and places neither had yet visited but hoped to someday. Elinor learned that he had once wanted to travel to the Italian coast before his responsibilities to the estate had made such plans impossible. He learned that she had a habit of losing herself in novels for entire afternoons, ignoring correspondence and social obligations alike, until someone physically pulled her away from the pages. As the afternoon wore on, other guests occasionally drifted close enough to observe them, offering polite nods and curious glances that Alina pretended not to notice. She was aware of the picture they made, walking together at the edge of the lake, and she suspected that by evening, this particular scene would have grown into something far more scandalous in the retelling than the quiet, careful conversation it actually was. Near the end of the visit, as guests began gathering their things and calling for carriages, Ashcombe walked Alina back toward the main house. Their pace had slowed without either of them quite noticing, as though some unspoken agreement had decided the afternoon should not end too quickly. "Thank you for coming today," he said, as they reached the edge of the terrace where her aunt waited with visible impatience. "I know it invites talk you did not ask for." "I invited some of it myself," Alina pointed out. "I did ask you to dance after all." "You did," he agreed, "and I find myself glad that you did, whatever talk follows because of it." There was a pause between them, brief but charged, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch longer than the seconds actually allowed. Alina felt the urge to say something further, something that might close whatever distance remained, but her aunt's voice calling her name from the terrace broke the moment before she could decide what that something might be. "Until we meet again, Miss Hale," Ashcombe said, bowing properly. "Until then, Your Grace," Alina answered, curtsying in return before turning toward her aunt. As her carriage pulled away from Ashcombe Hall, Alina glanced back once through the small window and saw him still standing on the terrace, watching the carriage go, his hands loose at his sides in the same way they had been the night of the ball. Something about the sight settled deep in her chest, a warmth she was not yet ready to name, and she turned forward again, watching the countryside slip past as the carriage carried her back toward the city, and whatever new round of gossip surely awaited her arrival. She was right about the gossip. By the time she reached her aunt's townhouse, 3 separate notes had already arrived from acquaintances eager to hear the details of her afternoon at Ashcombe Hall, and a 4th note, unsigned but clearly intended to wound, suggested that a girl of her modest fortune had best be careful not to reach above her station. Alina read that particular note twice, felt a brief flare of anger at its careless cruelty, and then tossed it into the fire without another thought. That evening, her aunt insisted on a proper family dinner, inviting Alina's brother, Henry, who had arrived in town only that week and had already heard 3 different versions of the garden party before he had even unpacked his trunks. Henry was 2 years older than Alina, practical to a fault, and possessed of an unshakable belief that his sister's happiness mattered more than any title attached to a suitor's name. "They are saying he has not smiled in 3 years," Henry said over the soup course, watching his sister carefully. "And now suddenly he laughs in his own garden because you asked him a question about roses." "People exaggerate," Alina said. "I asked him about his mother's flowers," he answered. "It was hardly the stuff of legend." "It is exactly the stuff of legend, as far as this city is concerned," Henry replied. "You do understand what you are walking into, Alina. A man like that carries more than a title. He carries 3 years of whispers that will not simply vanish because you found him pleasant company for an afternoon." "I am aware of what people say about him," Alina said, setting down her spoon with more force than she intended. "I have heard every version of the rumor, Henry. I have heard that his wife died in his arms mid-dance, that he locked himself away out of grief, that he has grown cold and strange in his solitude. I have heard all of it, and none of it matched the man I actually spoke with today." "And if some of it is true," Henry pressed gently, "what then?" Alina considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she turned over most things that mattered to her, refusing to answer simply for the sake of ending an uncomfortable conversation. "Then I suppose I will have learned something true about a man everyone else has only guessed at from a safe distance," she said finally. I would rather know a difficult truth than comfort myself with a convenient rumor, Henry. I have always preferred it that way. Her aunt, who had been listening with poorly concealed interest, could not resist adding her own opinion to the matter. Whatever the truth of his grief, Eleanor, you must consider your own position carefully. A duke's attention can lift a family as easily as it can expose one to ridicule, should things not proceed as everyone hopes. I am not proceeding toward anything, Aunt Margaret, Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she was aware of a small dishonesty hiding somewhere beneath them. She thought of the way Ashcombe had looked at the lake, the rawness in his voice when he admitted he had not visited that spot in 3 years, and she knew, with a quiet certainty she was not yet ready to admit aloud, that she wanted to see that rawness again, wanted to understand the whole shape of the grief he carried so carefully behind his composed exterior. Henry studied her across the table for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to settle something in his own mind, because he did not press the matter further that evening. Instead, he changed the subject to news from the countryside, and the conversation moved on to safer, lighter things, though Eleanor noticed her brother watching her with a thoughtful expression for the remainder of the meal. Later that night, alone in her room, Eleanor sat by the window and watched the lamplighters make their slow progress down the street below, each flame catching and holding against the darkness one at a time. She thought of the swans on the still water at Ashcombe Hall, of the careful way the Duke had spoken of his mother, of the sentence he had left unfinished by the lake. Before. He had not needed to say more, and she had not needed to ask, and something about that shared understanding felt more significant to her than any amount of polished conversation at a crowded ball. She had never much cared what people thought of her ambitions, real or imagined, and she was not about to start now, not when something far more interesting than gossip had begun to take root in the quiet space between herself and a lonely Duke who had only just remembered how to visit his own garden. Whatever came of it, she decided, blowing out her candle at last, she would rather walk toward it with open eyes than spend the season pretending she had not noticed it at all. The invitations kept arriving after that, one after another, until Eleanor's small writing desk was cluttered with cream-colored cards bearing the Ashcombe seal, a concert at the Assembly Rooms, a ride through the park on a crisp morning when the frost had not yet melted from the grass, a quiet supper with a handful of carefully chosen guests who spent more time watching Eleanor and the Duke than they did eating their own meals. Each meeting followed a similar pattern. Ashcombe would begin guarded, his conversation polite but distant, as though testing whether Eleanor's interest from the previous encounter had been some passing fancy that had already burned itself out. And each time, once he saw that it had not, something in him would loosen, just slightly, enough to let a real conversation take root beneath the polite one. Eleanor learned, in careful pieces, the shape of the man beneath the title. She learned that he read late into the night because sleep did not come easily to him. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that only appeared once he trusted the company he kept, and that once it appeared, it rarely left again. She learned that he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned dancing directly, though he never refused to dance with her again after that first evening. What she did not learn, not yet, was the full truth of what had happened 3 years ago. He mentioned his late wife only in fragments, small and careful, the way a man might touch a wound to check whether it had finally healed. Her name was Catherine. She had loved gardens as much as he did. She had died young. Beyond these bare facts, Ashcombe offered nothing, and Eleanor did not push, sensing that whatever lay beneath those fragments was not yet ready to be spoken aloud, not even to her. It was at a masquerade ball, held 3 weeks after the garden party, that everything began to shift more visibly. The house belonged to a wealthy merchant family eager to secure their place among the aristocracy, and half of fashionable society had turned out for the event, drawn as much by curiosity about the Duke's recent change in behavior as by the promise of good music and better wine. Alina arrived in a simple silver mask that covered only the upper half of her face, leaving her identity easy enough to guess for anyone who knew her well. She found Ashkum near the refreshment table, his own mask a deep, unadorned black that matched his coat, and though half his face was hidden, she recognized him instantly by the particular stillness of his posture. "You found me quickly," he said, "for someone meant to be in disguise." "I would recognize you anywhere," Alina admitted, "mask or no mask." They spent much of the evening together, moving between conversation and dancing with an ease that had grown between them over the past weeks. For the first time, Ashkum did not seem to notice the eyes following them across the room, or if he noticed, he no longer seemed to care as much as he once had. Alina found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, caught up in the particular magic of a masked ball, where the usual rules of propriety seemed to loosen just slightly along with the identities of the guests. It was during a pause between dances, as they stood near a tall window overlooking the merchant's carefully manicured garden, that a young man approached them with a confident stride that immediately put Alina on guard. His mask was gold and elaborate, clearly expensive, and he wore the kind of smile that suggested he was used to getting exactly what he wanted from any room he entered. "Miss Hale," he said, bowing with exaggerated flourish, "I have been trying to secure a dance with you all evening, but you seem determined to keep His Grace's attention entirely to yourself." Alina recognized the voice beneath the mask before he finished speaking. Lord Cashin Vane, a baron's son with a considerable fortune and an even more considerable opinion of himself, had made his interest in her known at the start of the season, an interest she had gently but firmly discouraged on more than one occasion. "Lord Vane," she said, keeping her tone pleasant but cool, "I did not realize you were in attendance tonight." "I would not miss an event where the most interesting match of the season might finally reveal itself," Vane said, his gaze sliding toward Ashkum with a sharpness that did not match his easy smile. "Though I confess, Your Grace, I am surprised to see you dancing so freely these days. I had heard you preferred to keep to the shadows." The comment landed with obvious intent, a small blade wrapped in polite conversation, and Alina felt Ashkum stiffen beside her, though his expression remained carefully composed. "People change, Lord Vane," Ashkum said evenly, "though I suspect you already knew that, given how eagerly you have watched for the change yourself." "I watch a great many things," Vane replied smoothly. "It is a habit of mine. I find people reveal the most interesting truths when they believe no one important is paying attention." He turned his attention fully to Alina then, his smile widening in a way that made her skin prickle with something close to distaste. "You must forgive my forwardness, Miss Hale, but a woman of your particular circumstances rising so quickly in such distinguished company invites a certain amount of scrutiny. I only hope, for your sake, that the Duke's attention proves as steady as it currently appears." The insult was thin enough to deny outright and sharp enough that Alina felt its edge regardless. She opened her mouth to answer, but Ashkum spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight beneath its calm. "Miss Hale's circumstances are not a subject open for your commentary, Lord Vane," he said. "I would suggest you find another topic for your evening's entertainment." Vane's smile flickered just briefly before settling back into its practiced ease. "Of course, Your Grace, I meant no offense, merely an observation." He bowed again, more shallowly this time, and excused himself into the crowd, though Alina caught him glancing back once, his gaze lingering on the two of them with an expression she could not quite read. Something about it unsettled her more than his words had, a calculation behind his eyes that suggested tonight's comments were only the opening move of something larger. "I apologize for that," Ashkum said, once Vane had disappeared into the throng of masked guests. "He has always had a talent for finding the exact spot where a comment will hurt the most." "You need not apologize on his behalf," Alina said, though she found herself unable to fully shake the unease his words had left behind. "I have dealt with men like Lord Vane before. They rarely trouble me for long." "He is not entirely wrong, though," Ashcombe said quietly, his eyes fixed on some point across the room. "About the scrutiny, I mean. I have not considered until recently how much weight my attention might place on you. It was thoughtless of me." "I am not so fragile that I cannot bear a little talk," Elinor said firmly. "I chose to ask you to dance that first night knowing full well what it might invite. I do not regret that choice, and I will not begin regretting it now simply because Lord Vane enjoys hearing himself speak." Something in her tone seemed to settle him, and the tension in his shoulders eased slightly, though a shadow of concern remained behind his eyes for the rest of the evening. They did not speak of Vane again that night, but Elinor noticed Ashcombe glancing toward the crowd more often afterward, as though checking to see where the golden mask had gone. The following week brought a different kind of unsettling encounter. Elinor had gone walking in the park with her maid, enjoying one of the first truly warm afternoons of the season, when she came across Ashcombe sitting alone on a bench near the lake, far from his usual carefully composed public presence. He did not notice her at first, his gaze fixed on the water, his shoulders bowed in a way she had never seen before, not even in their most private conversations. She approached slowly, uncertain whether to intrude, but something in his posture pulled her forward despite her hesitation. "Edmund," she said softly, using his given name for the first time, testing whether the familiarity would be welcome. He looked up, startled, and for a brief moment, before he could arrange his expression into something more composed, Elinor saw raw grief written plainly across his face, unguarded and unmistakable. "Forgive me," he said quickly, rising from the bench. "I did not expect company." "You need not apologize to me," Elinor said, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. "What has happened?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. "Today is the anniversary," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years since Catherine died. I always come here on this day. It is the only place I can bear to be." Elinor did not speak immediately, sensing that whatever came next needed room to exist without interruption. She simply sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and waited. "She loved this lake," he continued after a while. "We used to walk here together before we were married, when everyone still thought the match was a foolish one born of youthful infatuation rather than anything lasting. She would have laughed at how seriously I have taken her memory since. She never wanted me to grieve so completely. She told me once near the end that she wanted me to keep living, keep dancing, keep finding reasons to smile. I did not know, until recently, how completely I had failed to honor that particular wish." "You have not failed," Elinor said quietly. "Grief does not follow a schedule. It does not care what promises we make about how quickly we should recover from it." "Perhaps not," he said, "but I have wondered these past weeks whether allowing myself to feel something again is a betrayal of what she meant to me. Whether laughing with you, dancing with you, walking through my mother's roses with you, dishonors the memory I have spent 3 years protecting." Elinor considered her answer carefully, aware of the weight the moment carried, aware that whatever she said next might shape something important between them. "I did not know Catherine," she said finally, "but from everything you have told me about her, I do not think she would want you to spend the rest of your life standing still beside a lake, afraid to move forward simply because moving forward feels like forgetting. Remembering someone and continuing to live are not opposites, Edmund. I do not believe they ever were." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression shifted, the careful composure cracking just enough to reveal the depth of the exhaustion he had been carrying, the sheer weight of 3 years spent guarding a grief he had never fully allowed himself to release. "I was thrown back to that day," he said quietly. "The moment I saw you cross the ballroom floor toward me, I thought, for one terrible instant, that history was repeating itself, that I was about to lose someone else the very moment I let myself want anything again. Alina's breath caught slightly at the confession, though she did not ask him to explain further, sensing that the rawness of the moment did not require more words layered on top of it. Instead, she reached over and took his hand, simply holding it, offering no promises, no grand declarations, only the quiet certainty of her presence beside him. They sat together by the lake for a long while after that, saying little else, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained, until the afternoon light began to soften into evening, and Alina's maid gently reminded her that they ought to return before dark. Ashkum walked them back to the edge of the park, his hand lingering near hers longer than strict propriety allowed, and Alina found, walking home afterward, that something fundamental had shifted between them. A door that had been cracked open weeks ago now standing fully ajar, admitting a truth neither of them had been ready to name aloud until today. She did not yet know how much Lord Vane's watchful eyes had already begun turning that afternoon's private grief into fresh material for gossip, nor how quickly the whispers building around them would grow sharp enough to draw blood. What Alina could not have known was that Lord Vane had followed the park path that same afternoon, keeping a careful distance behind a row of hedges, drawn by nothing more than idle curiosity about where the Duke had disappeared to during a fashionable hour when most gentlemen preferred to be seen elsewhere. He had watched the entire scene by the lake unfold from a discreet distance, close enough to see the Duke's shoulders bowed in obvious distress, close enough to see Alina take his hand, though too far to hear the words exchanged between them. It was enough. Vane did not need the exact words to construct a story that would serve his purposes far better than the truth. By that same evening, he had already begun sharing a carefully edited version of what he had witnessed with a small circle of acquaintances at his club, men who traded in gossip the way merchants traded in grain, each retelling adding new weight to the original grain of truth, until it bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. The Duke wept openly, Vane told his companions over glasses of port, embellishing freely, practically collapsed at the girl's feet, right there in the park for anyone to see. She played the comforting angel beautifully, I will grant her that. Quite the performance, considering she has no fortune and precious little standing to offer him beyond a sympathetic ear. You make it sound calculated, one of his companions said, though clearly delighted by the suggestion regardless. Perhaps it is, Vane said, swirling the port in his glass. Or perhaps she is simply fortunate that grief makes men remarkably easy to manipulate. Either way, I suspect our reluctant Duke has found himself a rather convenient path back into society, provided the girl in question continues to play her part so effectively. The story spread exactly as such stories always did, gathering embellishments with each retelling until, by the following afternoon, it had transformed into something far uglier than anything that had actually taken place by the lake. Alina first heard the whispered version from her aunt, who repeated it with obvious distress, horrified at how quickly her niece's reputation had become entangled with cruel speculation about manipulation and calculated ambition. They are saying you sought him out deliberately that day, her aunt said, wringing her hands. That you knew it was the anniversary and used his grief to secure his affection. Alina, this is precisely the kind of talk that can ruin a young woman's prospects entirely, regardless of how untrue it might be. It is entirely untrue, Alina said, feeling anger rise sharp and sudden in her chest, hotter than she expected. I did not know it was the anniversary. I found him by chance, sitting alone, clearly troubled, and I stayed because leaving him like that would have been unconscionably cruel, not because I saw some opportunity to exploit. I believe you, her aunt said quickly. But belief does not silence a drawing room full of people eager for scandal, my dear. You must consider how this looks, regardless of what actually happened. Alina said nothing further that evening, though the accusation settled uncomfortably beneath her skin, a small, persistent ache that would not quite fade no matter how firmly she reminded herself that the truth remained on her side. She thought of Ashcombe's raw grief by the water, the trust he had extended toward her in that unguarded moment, and she felt a fierce protectiveness rise up alongside her anger, a determination that whatever cruel story Lord Vane had chosen to spin, it would not be allowed to poison something that had felt, in the moment it happened, entirely honest and entirely good. She did not yet know that the whispers had already reached Ashcombe himself, carried to him through a concerned friend eager to warn him before the gossip could do further damage. Nor did she know how deeply the accusation would cut into a man already so practiced at doubting whether he deserved any happiness at all. For now, walking through the quiet rooms of her aunt's townhouse that evening, Alina allowed herself simply to feel the quiet significance of what had passed between them by the water, and to hope, however cautiously, that whatever came next would be worth the risk they had both, in their own separate ways, finally chosen to take. The next public gathering that brought Alina and Ashcombe together again was a concert held at the home of Lady Pemberton, a woman known throughout the city for hosting the most talked-about events of any given month. By the time Alina arrived, the whispered version of the lakeside encounter had already circulated through nearly every fashionable drawing room in the city, and she felt the weight of it the moment she stepped through the door, in the sideways glances, in the conversations that dropped just slightly as she passed, in the fans that rose to cover mouths a heartbeat too late. She held her chin level and refused to let her steps falter, though the effort cost her more than she wanted to admit. She found Ashcombe near the back of the music room, and she noticed immediately that something had changed in him since their last meeting. The ease that had been growing between them, the small, unguarded warmth she had watched slowly returning to his face over the past weeks, had retreated behind a wall she recognized instantly, the same wall she had first noticed the night she asked him to dance. "You have heard," she said quietly, once she reached his side. "I have heard several versions," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "None of them particularly flattering to either of us." "None of them are true," Alina said. "You know that." "I know what I believe," he said. "Belief and proof are not always the same thing, and I have learned, Miss Hale, that the world rarely cares which one you possess when it has already decided on its story." The formality of her surname, after weeks of Alina, landed like a small blow, and she felt her chest tighten with something between hurt and rising frustration. "You cannot possibly believe I would use your grief against you," she said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear it. "I sat with you by that lake because you were suffering, and because I could not bring myself to walk away and leave you alone with it. And yet Lord Vane tells quite a compelling story about a young woman clever enough to recognize opportunity when it presents itself weeping conveniently at her feet," Ashcombe said, and though his tone remained even, Alina could hear the strain beneath it, the exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 years bracing for exactly this kind of betrayal and had let himself hope, foolishly he clearly now believed, that it might not come. "Do you truly believe that of me?" Alina asked, her voice tightening with the effort of holding back the anger building in her chest. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though wrestling with an answer he did not entirely want to give. "I do not know what I believe anymore," he said finally. "I know that every time I have allowed myself to trust something good in these past 3 years, it has cost me more than I was prepared to pay. I know that Catherine died believing I would find happiness again, and instead I have spent 3 years learning that happiness, when it appears, tends to arrive wearing a mask that hides something else entirely underneath." The words struck harder than Alina expected, not because they were cruel, but because she could hear, underneath the accusation, the genuine terror of a man who had convinced himself that trusting her had been a mistake precisely because trusting anyone at all felt like inviting disaster. She wanted to reach for him, the way she had reached for his hand by the lake, but something in his posture warned her that the gesture would not be welcomed now, not while the wall stood so firmly rebuilt between them. "I am not Lord Vane's story," she said finally, her voice steady despite the ache building behind it. "I am not the calculating creature he has invented to entertain his friends over port. If you cannot see the difference between what actually happened by that lake and the ugly thing he has twisted it into, then perhaps you never truly saw me at all, only a convenient distraction from 3 years of loneliness." She had not meant for the words to come out quite so sharp, but once spoken, she found she did not regret them, watching instead to see how he would respond. For a moment, something flickered across his face, a crack in the careful composure, as though her words had landed somewhere he had not expected them to reach. "Alina," he started, his voice softening slightly, the formality slipping. But before he could continue, Lord Vane himself appeared at the edge of their conversation, drawn by some instinct for exactly the wrong moment, his gold mask from the previous ball now replaced by an equally polished smile that did nothing to soften the calculation behind his eyes. "Your Grace, Miss Hale," he said smoothly, bowing with exaggerated politeness, "I hope I am not interrupting anything important." "You are," Ashcombe said flatly, his composure snapping back into place with visible effort. "I only wish to offer my sympathies," Vane continued, ignoring the clear dismissal in the Duke's tone. "Grief is such a delicate thing, is it not, Your Grace? I imagine it must be difficult, discovering how easily it can be mistaken for something else entirely by those eager to take advantage of a vulnerable moment." The insinuation hung thick in the air between them, and Alina felt a surge of fury rise sharp and sudden through her chest, hot enough that her hands curled into fists at her sides before she could stop them. She thought of every careful, guarded piece of himself Ashcombe had offered her over these past weeks, the fragments of his late wife's memory, the rawness by the lake, the small reluctant smiles she had worked to earn one at a time, and she found she could not simply stand there and let this man dismantle all of it with a few carefully aimed words. "Lord Vane," she said, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of the room with a clarity that drew several nearby heads to turn toward them, "I believe you have mistaken your own cruelty for cleverness for quite some time now, and I find I have grown tired of watching you mistake the two." A few gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered nearby, drawn by the obvious tension crackling between the three of them. Vane's smile faltered just slightly before he recovered it, though something colder had entered his expression now. "Careful, Miss Hale," he said quietly. "You are already standing on rather uncertain ground. I would not make it worse by insulting a peer in public." "I am not insulting a peer," Alina said. "I am simply describing what I have observed, which I understand is a habit you claim to admire in others, provided it does not turn its attention toward yourself." The room had gone properly quiet now, the music from the far end forgotten as guests turned to watch the unfolding scene with the particular hunger of people who lived for exactly this kind of spectacle. Alina felt the weight of every stare pressing against her, and for a moment, the old instinct to retreat, to soften her words and smooth over the confrontation, rose up strong inside her. She pushed it down. "I came to that lake because I saw a man suffering," she continued, turning now to address not just Vane but the gathered crowd as well, her voice steady despite the anger still burning beneath it. "I did not know what day it was. I did not calculate an advantage. I simply could not walk past someone in pain and pretend I had not seen it. If that makes me foolish in the eyes of this room, then I will happily remain foolish, because the alternative, apparently, is becoming the kind of person who finds entertainment in twisting another person's grief into gossip for a dinner party." Silence followed her words, heavy and uncertain, until Ashcombe, who had been watching her with an unreadable expression throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "She is telling the truth," he said. "I was there. I know what happened and I know what did not. Lord Vane's version exists only because cruelty entertains a certain kind of audience, and I have grown tired this evening of providing that entertainment." Vane's composure cracked fully now, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he mastered it back into something resembling politeness. "Of course, Your Grace," he said stiffly. "I meant no harm, merely idle conversation, nothing more." "Idle conversation does not typically require watching a private moment from behind a hedge," Ashcombe said coldly, and Alina saw several guests exchange startled glances at this new piece of information, understanding now exactly how Vane had constructed his story. "I would suggest you find a new hobby, Lord Vane. This one has cost you rather more standing tonight than it gained you." Vane opened his mouth to respond, seemed to think better of it, and instead offered a stiff, shallow bow before retreating quickly through the crowd, his earlier confidence entirely deflated. The guests around them began murmuring again, though the tone had shifted now, curiosity replacing scandal, sympathy beginning to outweigh suspicion. Alina turned to Ashcombe once Vane had disappeared, her anger still simmering beneath the surface, uncertain now what remained between them after everything that had just been said. He met her gaze steadily, something raw and apologetic written plainly across his face. "I should not have doubted you," he said quietly, for her ears alone now. "Even for a moment. I let 3 years of fear speak louder than what I actually know to be true about you, and I am sorry for that." "You were afraid," Alina said, her anger softening slightly, though not entirely, the sting of his earlier words still fresh. "I understand fear, Edmund. I do not entirely forgive it yet, but I understand it." "I do not expect forgiveness tonight," he said. "I only hope you will allow me the chance to earn it properly, rather than simply apologizing for it in a crowded room and calling the matter settled." Alina studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his expression against the hurt still lodged beneath her ribs, and found, despite everything, that she was not yet ready to walk away from whatever this was between them, however complicated Lord Vane's cruelty had made it tonight. "Then earn it," she said simply, and left him standing there as she moved back toward the safety of her aunt's side, aware of every eye in the room still following her, but no longer entirely certain this time whether that attention frightened her at all. Her aunt said nothing on the carriage ride home, sensing perhaps that whatever had passed inside Lady Pemberton's music room needed room to settle before it could bear discussion. Alina sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the darkened street slide past the window, replaying the evening in careful pieces, the way one might turn over a bruise to check how deeply it went. She was not angry at Ashcombe anymore, not truly, though the memory of his doubts still stung somewhere beneath her composure. She understood, in a way she suspected few others in that crowded room ever could, exactly how deeply 3 years of guarded grief could warp a man's ability to trust anything good that came near him. She had seen it in the rawness by the lake, in the careful way he offered pieces of himself only in small, measured doses, as though anything given too freely might be taken away again without warning. What troubled her more, sitting in the quiet dark of the carriage, was the realization of how quickly Lord Vane had nearly succeeded in unraveling something that had taken weeks to build. A few whispered sentences over a glass of port, a story bent just enough to serve his purposes, and an entire room had been ready to believe the worst of her without a shred of actual proof. It frightened her, not because she doubted her own conduct, but because it revealed exactly how fragile reputation truly was for a woman in her position, how easily an ambitious man's cruelty could dismantle in an evening what honesty had spent a full season constructing. She thought, too, of the moment Ashcombe had defended her before the entire room, his voice steady and certain despite whatever doubt had briefly clouded his judgment earlier in their private conversation. There had been something fierce in the way he spoke, something that told her the man beneath the careful composure was not entirely as guarded as 3 years of grief had trained him to appear. He had chosen, in that moment, to stand beside her rather than retreat into the safety of polite neutrality. And she found that choice mattered to her more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. By the time the carriage reached her aunt's townhouse, Alina had settled into a fragile kind of peace with the evening's events, though a small, persistent worry remained lodged beneath it. Lord Vane had retreated tonight, humiliated in front of half of fashionable society, but men like him rarely accepted defeat gracefully, and Alina suspected this was not the last she would hear from him before the season drew to its close. She climbed the stairs to her room slowly, aware of the exhaustion settling into her limbs, and sat by the window a long while before finally allowing herself to sleep, her thoughts circling back again and again to the raw apology in Ashcombe's eyes, and to the uncertain, fragile hope that whatever had cracked between them tonight might still, given time and honesty, be mended into something stronger than it had been before. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet study lit by a single low lamp, Ashcombe sat with a letter half-written and abandoned on the desk before him, his mind circling the same evening from an entirely different angle. He thought of Catherine's voice, the one memory of her he trusted more than any other, telling him gently that grief was never meant to be a cage. He thought of Alina's steady defiance in front of a room full of people eager to see her falter, and he understood, with a clarity that had been building slowly for weeks now, that he had spent 3 years mistaking stillness for safety, when in truth it had only ever been a slower kind of loss. He set down his pen, extinguished the lamp, and resolved that tomorrow he would find a way to prove that his apology tonight had been only the beginning. 3 days passed without word from Ashcombe, and Alina found herself checking the post each morning with a carefully hidden eagerness she refused to admit even to herself. Her aunt watched this ritual with growing concern, certain that silence after such a public scene could only mean the worst, though Alina found she trusted the memory of his eyes at Lady Pemberton's more than she trusted her aunt's anxious speculation. On the 4th morning, a letter arrived, not from Ashcombe directly, but from his sister, Lady Grace Whitfield, whom Alina had met only briefly at previous gatherings. The letter requested Alina's company for tea that same afternoon, with no further explanation offered, and Alina spent the hours before the appointed time turning over every possible reason for such an unusual invitation. Lady Grace received her in a small, sunlit parlor decorated with the same understated elegance Alina had noticed at Ashcombe Hall, and she wasted little time on pleasantries once the tea had been poured. "I will be direct with you, Miss Hale," Lady Grace said, folding her hands in her lap. "My brother has told me everything about the lake, about Lord Vane's cruelty, about his own foolish doubt at Lady Pemberton's gathering. I asked you here because I wanted to see for myself the woman who managed, in a matter of weeks, to accomplish what 3 years of family concern could not." "I am not certain I have accomplished anything, my lady," Alina said carefully. "You brought him back to the lake," Lady Grace said. "You brought him back to his own garden. I watched my brother disappear into grief after Catherine died, and I had begun to believe he intended to stay there permanently, however much the rest of us worried over him. And then, quite suddenly, he began attending events he had avoided for years, dancing again, laughing in a way I had genuinely forgotten he was capable of. I do not credit coincidence for that change, Miss Hale." Alina felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such open sincerity from a woman she barely knew. "I only asked him to dance," she said finally. "I did not intend to change anything so significant." "Intentions rarely determine outcomes," Lady Grace said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I did not invite you here to embarrass you, Miss Hale, only to tell you that whatever comes next between you and my brother, you have already given this family something we feared we had lost permanently. I wanted you to know that, regardless of how the rest of the season unfolds." The conversation shifted after that to lighter subjects, though Alina left the townhouse with Lady Grace's words settled deep in her chest, a warmth that stayed with her through the carriage ride home and lingered still, when she finally retired that evening. The following afternoon, while Alina sat in the small garden behind her aunt's townhouse, attempting to focus on a book she had read 3 times without absorbing a single word, her brother Henry found her there, settling onto the bench beside her with the particular expression he wore whenever he had something important to say and had not yet decided how to say it. "I saw Lord Vane at the club yesterday," he said finally. "He was noticeably quieter than usual. I gather word of his little performance at Lady Pemberton's has not done him any favors among his own circle." "I cannot say I am sorry to hear it," Alina admitted. "Nor am I," Henry said. "Though I confess, Alina, I came here today more concerned about you than about Lord Vane's reputation. You have been distracted all week, distant, even. I want to know if that is worry or something else entirely." Alina set down her book, considering how honestly to answer her brother, who had watched over her with quiet protectiveness since they were children, and had never once demanded more honesty from her than she was ready to give. "I do not know what it is," she said finally. "I know that I have not stopped thinking of him since that evening. I know that when Lord Vane spoke his cruel little story, my anger was not for my own reputation, but for what it might cost Edmund, who has already carried so much. I have never felt quite that particular kind of anger before, Henry, protective rather than merely wounded." Henry studied her for a long moment, something softening in his expression. "That sounds a great deal like love to me, Alina, whether or not you are prepared to call it that yet." "I did not ask for your diagnosis," Alina said, though without any real heat behind the words. "You rarely ask for the things you most need to hear," Henry said, nudging her shoulder gently with his own. "I only want you to be certain, whatever happens next, that you are walking toward this because you want it, and not simply because you refuse to be told by gossiping strangers what you are and are not allowed to want. You have always had a stubborn streak, sister. I would hate to see it mistaken, even by yourself, for something less honest than it actually is." Alina considered her brother's words long after he had left her alone in the garden, turning them over with the same careful attention she gave most things that mattered. She thought of Ashcombe's raw grief by the lake, the fierce defense he had offered her in front of a room full of curious strangers, the quiet apology in his eyes afterward, and she found, sitting there in the fading afternoon light, that Henry's diagnosis, however unwelcome in the delivery, was not one she found herself inclined to argue against. The formal invitation arrived 2 days later, addressed once again directly to Alina, requesting her presence at a ball to be held at Ashcombe Hall itself, the first such gathering the Duke had hosted in his own home since before Catherine's death. The news spread through the city almost as quickly as their first dance had, though this time the whispers carried more curiosity than scandal, society collectively holding its breath to see what such an unprecedented event might reveal. Alina spent the days before the ball in a state of careful anticipation, uncertain exactly what awaited her but increasingly certain that whatever it was, she intended to meet it without hesitation. Her aunt fussed endlessly over her appearance, insisting on a deep blue gown that Alina privately thought entirely too elaborate for her tastes, though she allowed the fitting without much argument, sensing that tonight, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, mattered more than most evenings had before it. On the morning of the ball itself, Alina woke early, unable to settle back into sleep despite the late hour she had finally retired the night before. She spent the morning in restless activity, rearranging items on her dressing table, reading letters she had already read twice, and generally failing to occupy her mind with anything that did not eventually circle back to the evening ahead. Her aunt, sensing the particular nature of Alina's nerves, arrived in her room shortly after midday with the deep blue gown draped carefully over one arm and an expression of unusual gentleness on her face. "I know I have fussed a great deal this season," her aunt said, laying the gown across the bed, "more than you likely wanted and certainly more than you asked for. But I want you to know, whatever tonight brings, that I am proud of the way you have carried yourself through all of it. The gossip, the cruelty, Lord Vane's ugliness. You did not flinch from any of it, Alina, and I do not think I told you often enough how much I admired that. Alina, caught off guard by the sincerity in her aunt's voice, found herself blinking back an unexpected sting of emotion. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret," she said. "I confess I was not always certain I was handling any of it correctly." "Few people ever are in the moment," her aunt said, smoothing a wrinkle from the gown's skirt. "It is only afterward, looking back, that we recognize courage for what it was. Now, come. If we do not begin dressing soon, you shall arrive at Ashcombe Hall in a dreadful rush, and I will not have people saying the Hale family cannot manage a simple ball gown on schedule." The dressing took the better part of 2 hours, between the careful arrangement of Alina's hair and the fitting of the gown itself, which her aunt insisted on adjusting twice more despite the dressmaker's earlier assurances that it fit perfectly. By the time Alina finally studied her reflection in the tall looking glass, she scarcely recognized the calm, composed woman staring back at her, though she suspected the composure was considerably more fragile than it appeared. "You look lovely," her aunt said, appearing behind her in the mirror's reflection, "though I suspect the Duke will notice considerably more than your appearance tonight." "I hope so," Alina admitted quietly. "I have grown rather tired of being noticed only for the scandal I supposedly represent." Her aunt squeezed her shoulder gently, offering no further words, and together they made their way down to the waiting carriage as the late afternoon began its slow slide toward evening. Ashcombe Hall, when Alina's carriage finally arrived, blazed with light from every window, the great stone house transformed for the first time in years into something warm and welcoming, rather than distant and shuttered. Servants moved efficiently among arriving guests, and Alina felt her heart quicken as she stepped through the grand entrance, aware of the significance of what this gathering represented, not just for society's endless appetite for spectacle, but for the man who had chosen, after 3 years of careful isolation, to open his own doors again. She found him near the ballroom entrance, greeting guests with a composure that seemed, to Alina's careful eye, less like the guarded formality of before and more like genuine, if slightly nervous, hospitality. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression immediately, a warmth breaking through the careful neutrality he had maintained for the earlier arrivals. "Miss Hale," he said, and though the words themselves were formal, his eyes carried none of the distance they had held at Lady Pemberton's. "I am glad you came." "I would not have missed this for anything," Alina said honestly. "Your sister tells me this is the first ball you have hosted here in quite some time." 3 years, he confirmed. "I was not entirely certain I would manage it until quite recently." They did not have much opportunity for private conversation as more guests arrived, though Alina noticed him finding small moments throughout the evening to seek her out. A brief word here, a glance across the room there, small threads of connection maintained even amid the demands of hosting such a significant gathering. She spent the earlier part of the evening in conversation with acquaintances, aware of the curious glances still following her but finding, for the first time all season, that she genuinely did not mind them. It was well past midnight, after most of the formal dances had concluded, and the evening had settled into its more relaxed final hours, that Ashcombe finally crossed the ballroom floor toward her, the same floor where their story had begun weeks before, though this time the room noticed his approach rather than hers. "Miss Hale," he said, bowing properly before her, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to watch. "Might I have this dance?" The gesture carried a weight Alina understood immediately, watching the small crowd around them fall quiet in recognition of what was happening. This was not a woman crossing a room to challenge a frightening reputation. This was a man choosing, deliberately and publicly, in his own home, in front of everyone who had spent 3 years watching him from a cautious distance, to want something again, openly, without the shield of grief or distance to hide behind. "You may," Alina said, placing her hand in his. The orchestra began a slow waltz, And this time, as they moved together across the floor, there was none of the careful testing of ice that had marked their first dance. His hand at her waist was steady now, certain, and the space between them felt smaller, more intentional than it ever had before. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, as they turned slowly beneath the chandeliers, "beyond the one I offered at Lady Pemberton's. I let 3 years of fear speak for me that night, when I should have trusted what I actually knew about you. I am sorry for that, and I hope, in time, you might come to fully forgive it." "I forgave it that same evening," Alina said, "though I appreciate hearing it said properly, without an audience of gossiping guests demanding a spectacle." He smiled at that, the same reluctant, genuine smile she had first coaxed from him weeks ago, though it came more easily now, less guarded. "I have spent 3 years believing that wanting something meant risking losing it entirely," he said. "Catherine used to tell me that grief and living were not opposites, though I did not truly understand what she meant until you said something remarkably similar to me by that lake. I have thought of little else since." "And what have you concluded?" Alina asked, echoing deliberately the words she had spoken to him after their very first dance. "That I have gathered quite a bit more data since our last conversation on the subject," he said, "and that my conclusion, this time, is rather more definitive than it was before." "Which is?" He did not answer immediately, instead guiding her through a slow turn that brought them close enough that his next words were meant for her alone, low and certain beneath the swell of the orchestra around them. "That I would very much like this not to be our last dance," he said, "nor our second, nor any particular number I might count toward some eventual conclusion. I find I am no longer interested in counting at all, Alina. I am only interested in continuing." Alina felt something settle deep in her chest at his words, a warmth that had nothing to do with the crowded, overheated ballroom around them, and everything to do with the certainty in his voice, the steadiness of his hand at her waist, the way his eyes held hers now without the careful distance that had once separated them so completely. "I think," she said, "that I would like that as well." The music continued around them, and other couples had begun to fill the floor again, though Alina was scarcely aware of them, caught entirely in the quiet significance of the moment unfolding between herself and the man everyone else had spent 3 years too frightened to approach. She thought of the whispers that had followed her since that very first night, the fear and fascination and cruel speculation that had trailed behind every step of this strange, unlikely courtship. And she found she did not regret a single moment of it, not the risk of that first bold walk across a crowded ballroom, not the vulnerability of the lake, not even the sharp sting of Lord Vane's cruelty, because every difficult step had led, eventually, to exactly this. When the song finally ended, Ashcombe did not release her hand the way custom required, the way he had done so carefully after their very first dance weeks before. He simply held it, his fingers curled gently around hers, and made no move to let go, even as the final notes faded and the dancers around them began to applaud the orchestra and drift toward refreshments and fresh conversation. "Your Grace," Alina said softly, glancing down at their joined hands with a small, knowing smile, "I believe the dance has ended." "I am aware," he said, making no move whatsoever to release her. "And yet you have not let go." "No," he agreed, his eyes steady on hers, warm now in a way that held none of the guarded distance of their first encounter. "I find I have grown rather tired of letting go of things that matter to me, Alina. I intend to make a habit of holding on instead, starting tonight, and continuing for as long as you will have me." Around them, the ballroom carried on in its usual bright chaos, servants moving through the crowd with trays of refreshments, the orchestra beginning a new, livelier tune, guests laughing and gossiping in equal measure about the significance of what they had just witnessed. But Alina scarcely noticed any of it, standing there with her hand held firmly in his, feeling, for the first time since she had crossed that first ballroom floor weeks ago, that whatever the whispers said about the Duke everyone else had feared, She alone had asked the right question, at exactly the right moment, and found in his answer something worth every risk it had taken to discover it.